So let's move on to the next section of our podcast, and it's going to be another recap of an event that we talked about last week pretty extensively. We gave some picks for the event, and that's Submission Underground 24, which took place on Sunday on UFC Fight Pass. They had their 8-man men's absolute tournament to figure out who will be facing Mason Fowler on July 18th, and it was a pretty exciting bracket, I'm not going to lie. You want to go ahead and go through those first round matchups. I think each of us picked Roberto, MARINHO, Boehm, and Maximov. Maximov was the one that we were wrong on. I believe it was Weisgrim that beat him in the quarterfinals. All the rest of those picks we were correct on, 3-1. Do you have the exact results up in front of you?
I do. So this is one of the unique submission undergrounds in that there's a lot of finishes across the board, and it ran very quickly. So in the first round, or the quarterfinals, Kyle Boehm beat Renato Tagliari by submission in 35 seconds.
Wow.
So that was very quick, obviously. The only match in the first round to go the distance and into the EBI overtime was the Weisgrim-Maximov, which ended with Weisgrim winning by the right time, essentially, is what. He didn't get a submission, he just didn't get submitted quicker.
Yeah, and that was interesting because you saw Maximov use the armbar instead of the back mount in overtime. And while I do appreciate the fact that people are doing that, as far as if you're trying to actually win, I think it's a pretty difficult thing to do to pick the armbar right off the bat. Most people pick the back mount so that they can develop that ride time, build that up, and then if they need to in the second or third round, if they need to get a submission, they go to that armbar position. But you saw him utilize that for, I believe, the first 2 rounds, and then he tried to go on the back in the third round. And unless you're Amanda Loewen, who we're going to talk about here in a little bit, maybe that's not the best strategy.
So I've done a lot of EBI overtime tournaments. That's what I did for the longest time up until my first IBJJF tournament was actually in 2019, so not very long ago, and a handful, less than 5 points tournaments up to that point. My strategy going into that was always to build up my ride time as long as possible. So the first 2 rounds, if I had those, it's going to be get my ride time up. And then if I need to have that Hail Mary quick submission, I think I would go with the armbar every single time. There's only a handful of times I had a match against a guy, Eric Anderson, down from 10th Planet Phoenix, and I faced him at the bullpen submissions series in Tucson, and we had to go to ride time, and that's what he chose to go to armbar 3 times in a row, and I was able to escape, but I built up my ride time. Not the proudest way to win, obviously, but a win's a win in those situations, especially when you have money on the line.
Absolutely. So those were the first round matchups, and then it was in the second round where we had a little bit of different picks. I picked Pedro and Kyle. You picked Roberto and Kyle. Kyle went through with another dominating victory in the second round, a pretty quick heel hook if I am
Before
correct.
we get to the second round, let's finish out the first round.
Oh, we're not done with that.
So we had Roberto Jimenez versus Adam Smith. This was actually the longest submission, so the submission that took the longest in the first round and of the entire night. He took 2 minutes and 51 seconds to get a rear naked choke. And then the final first round match was actually going to be Pedro MARINHO versus Andrew Seidlinger. I guess, sorry, mispronounced your name. It is what it is. But Pedro heel hooked him in 45 seconds, which leads into our second round, where we did have a difference in selection, where you had Pedro and I had Roberto, but we both had Kyle. Kyle won quickly again with a 43-second heel hook. So I'm not the best at math, but at this point in time, he has a total of 1 minute and 13 seconds of mat time.
It's pretty quick for first 2 rounds in an absolute tournament, especially going into that final nice and fresh.
Correct. And then the match that clashed us against each other was Pedro MARINHO versus Roberto Jimenez. I was actually surprised at how quickly this happened. I figured that if these two did face each other, it would be a overtime match. And it actually didn't end up that way. It ended up with Pedro securing a heel hook in 1 minute and 42 seconds against Roberto. And it was a good heel hook. It was from, he was doing it off of a leg drag, I believe, and then sat back for a modified 50-50 position and got an inside heel hook.
Yeah. and you actually saw him go for that same position in the finals, which we'll talk about here in a little bit. But before we get to the finals, our women's absolute championship match between Amanda Loewen and Raquel Canuto, which the theme of this match was Amanda Loewen holding on. In the regulation period, we saw Raquel Canuto get on the back. We saw her lock in a deep back mount triangle, hunting for the arms. What the hell you got up there? Derrick's got something funny on his screen, and I have no clue what it is. But anyways, the women's absolute championship, Amanda Loewen holds on 3 rounds in a row. She was able to hold on to that armbar position for the entire 2-minute period. It was actually the difference was in the first round, she was able to escape Raquel Canuto's back control with, I believe, 6 seconds left in the 2-minute round. So that was the difference between her winning and losing. We saw her even late in that 3rd round. Raquel was essentially out of the armbar position. She had her armbarring arm free, but it was actually the arm that she had inside protecting her arm from the armbar that Amanda bicep sliced through and just held on to with like a triangle with no head inside.
So she triangled her arm.
She triangled her arms, essentially. It was like a bicep slicer and just held on until the bell. So you could tell she wasn't super happy with the performance, but a win nonetheless, and she retains the title as the women's absolute champion at Submission Underground. And it sounds like there's a handful of big matches coming for her. Chael hinted at Gabby Garcia. She hinted at, I can't remember who else he hinted at.
Gabby never finishes, and she's running from Craig, so that makes sense.
So it would be interesting to see who they bring back for Amanda Loewen next time around. And that leads us into the finals of the Submission Underground Absolute Tournament, which pitted Kyle Boehm against Pedro Marinho, and we saw a fairly uneventful regulation period. Kyle didn't do a whole lot. He basically played from his back and tried to make Pedro come at him. Pedro had really the only notable attack of the match with that same inside heel hook entry that we saw him hit in the first round, and it was in the overtime period where Pedro again made the mistake of picking the armbar position. Kyle was able to stack him up and get out of there early in that first round, and then Boehm takes the back, and when it looked like Pedro was about to escape, he had that body triangle still locked in and basically just spinal cranked the ever-living shit out of Pedro, and it looked pretty damn painful.
Actually, the official result is a rear naked choke.
A rear naked choke, yeah, whatever you want to call it, but I call that a spinal crank because Pedro was sitting there holding his back, fucking, that shit looked like it hurt.
Should have got some lambskin condoms. But that just goes into the weirdness that goes along with the UBI rounds. And I think that also plays into how you've seen less and less of it being used these days. EBI, don't get me wrong, I love the EBI rules if both people are game to play. And I still prefer it over a lot of things. Don't get me wrong, I enjoy the competition. It's just unfortunate when we have situations, not necessarily with Kyle, don't get me wrong there, but where you have somebody that has dominated the entire regulation and then loses in the overtime simply because they're going with short time, 5 minutes. No real competition or event does 5 minutes for the regulation.
Especially for high-level black belts. That's such a short
match. IBJJF adult
takes 5 minutes to pass the guard sometimes.
Yeah, so that's what's tough, is you kind of feel bad for the ones who, like Canuto, who controlled most of the match. It's unfortunate, but again, she signed up for it, right? So that's how it goes down. That's just how it is. But it will be interesting to see Kyle face Mason and what his game plan is with that, because when you saw him face Gordon, Kyle, he microdosed, first of all. And then he went out there and just kind of had his little slow playing game. And I wonder if that's what's going to transition or going to be his tactic in this, is if he's going to try and get Mason into those overtime rounds. And while it seems like Kyle is the bigger competitor, and he very well may walk around bigger than Mason, it's interesting to see that Mason won the 99 kilo division on the West Coast Trials in 2019, while Kyle competed at the 88 kilo. So That'll be something to look forward to. I believe it's July 17th.
July 18th.
18th,
Yep.
excuse me. So,
Sunday, July 18th, it'll be Mason Fowler versus Kyle Boehm for the Submission Underground Absolute title. Again, I think it'll be interesting because both guys have really made their mark in that EBI overtime rule set, taking the back in overtime. And Mason's known as a finisher from that position.
Yep.
He's
ask Craig Jones.
Yeah, right.
Second in
Over the
everything.
face, like, tucking your chin is not a defense to the rear naked choke, especially against somebody with a squeeze like Mason Fowler.
It's still amazing to me that Mason is a brown belt.
I think he may have recently received his black belt. I could be wrong on that, but I want to say that he did receive his black belt after the last submission under.
Okay, so if it's that recent, that would make sense. But even up to that point, him being a brown belt, it was amazing because he won West Coast Trials. He took Craig Jones almost to the distance and at ADCC, and then he beat Craig Jones twice, and then all those other black belts. So
Yeah.
it's
Well, and
kinda
even
crazy.
in that match at ADCC, Craig admitted that there's a sweep that should have counted for Mason,
Yeah.
which would have won him the match. So Mason Fowler is a high-level grappling competitor,
Oh, yeah.
and definitely deserving of the shine that he's been getting over there at Submission Underground the last year or so. I believe 10 or 11-0 as their absolute champion. Excited to see him and Kyle Boehm to throw down on July 18th.
Definitely.
That wraps up our coverage of the Submission Underground 24. Again, their next event coming up on July 18th. Looking forward to that. We'll see all of the other matchups that come out. I actually know about a matchup that I can't talk about on here because it hasn't yet been revealed. But Andy Varela's got himself a pretty exciting match against somebody who we talked about tonight or on the episode today.